Ruston. Senator Bartlett.
Thank you, Mr President. I'd like to speak tonight about something that's happening right now in Alice Springs involving a number of people from my home state of Queensland. And it regards a trial that's occurring about some people who conducted a peaceful protest at Pine Gap quite recently. The Pine Gap spy base has been in operation now for just over 50 years, or this original Pine Gap agreement with the US government was signed in 1966. And in September last year, several hundred Australians from a range of ages and backgrounds and professions and faiths gathered in Alice Springs to mark the 50th anniversary of the signing of that Pine Gap agreement and to protest against it and to continue part of what has been a very long tradition of protest regarding the Pine Gap spy base. And it is worth emphasising that the role of this base as a part of the global war machine has increased dramatically in recent times. So those concerns were expressed by many protesters through the 80s and 90s and early parts of this century are more valid than ever. If I could quote esteemed academic and one of the foremost experts on this issue in Australia, Professor Richard Tanter, he said, "Pine Gap literally hardwires us into the activities of the American military. So whether or not the Australian government thinks, for example, an attack on North Korea is either justified or a wise and sensible move, we will be part of that. Our nation will be part of it. We'll be culpable in terms of the consequences, and we potentially will get the blowback of the consequences." And let me just emphasise that there. That says whether or not the Australian government thinks that it's a good idea what the US might decide to do in regards to an attack on North Korea or any other nation. Not the Australian people. We don't get a say in that. I mean, Australian people don't even get a say when our own government decides to go to war, but at least it's an open statement, and at least we can talk about it and ask questions in Parliament, even if the people can't have a direct say. But on this, and what the US government might do, not only the Australian people, but the Australian government has no direct say. And this is relevant not just for any potential attack that the US, under the leadership of President Trump no less, might decide to do on a whim one day, but what is happening now. And it is a well-established fact now that the Pine Gap spy base is a key part of enabling an extensive number of drone attacks which have been documented even by the US government themselves, the ones they have admitted to be responsible for the death of thousands of civilians under former President Obama, under former President Bush before him, and under the current president as well. And I would like to quote Malala Yousafzai, the esteemed young woman now who won the Nobel Peace Prize and inspired people around the world for standing up against terrorism and the Taliban that tried to shoot her in the head, or did shoot her in the head, tried to kill her for the crime of going to school. And when she got that Peace Prize and she had that audience with President Obama, and she asked him directly, "Please stop dropping those bombs from those drones. You are just making things worse. You are making the wars worse. You are making terrorism worse." She, unfortunately, of course, was ignored. But that request from her should be a request to our government as well and the Australian people, because we are part of that via our continuing agreement with Pine Gap. And that is why I certainly express strong support for those people who have protested throughout the years and the decades, and including last year. And it is appropriate for me to pay tribute to many parliamentary colleagues of the past who have been part of that, and perhaps in reflection on my own not common situation of being a former representative here with the Democrats and now with the Greens, noting at least a couple of other senators, Senators Jean Jenkins and Senator Janet Powell, were with the Democrats, who also subsequently joined the Greens and ran as candidates down the track, part of many others, Senator Vicky Bourne and others, and of course many Greens, Senator Scott Ludlam, Senator Joe Valentine, the very first Green senator in this chamber, and many others who have continued to be part of providing support for the peace movement, and the many people who have expressed extreme concern about the role this base plays in continuing and expanding war and death around the globe, and scandalously alongside that, the absolute zero information and zero say the Australian people have over it. And we've heard in the context of a very different debate this week a lot of talk about freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Now, last year, as part of those protests there, 6 Australian citizens entered the grounds of the Pine Gap base to sing songs and pray. That was the extent of their protest, very much a faith-based protest, clearly a non-violent protest. They were arrested, as occurs in these circumstances, but unlike almost every other circumstance where such protesters have been charged with trespass, this government and the current Attorney-General chose, and proactively chose, to prosecute these citizens for unlawful entry under the Defence Special Undertakings Act of 1952, a Cold War Act that was drafted to secure areas for British nuclear testing. That was the purpose of it, but since expanded to enable the protection and almost ultimate total secrecy of this spy base in the middle of the country. So it's an explicit decision of this Attorney-General to prosecute these people, and right at this minute the trial is happening and the Commonwealth is explicitly seeking to jail these people. That's the sole reason the Attorney-General is using this Act, to try to get these people jailed, potentially for up to 7 years, for praying and singing songs of lament about the death that is enabled by the Pine Gap spy base. I fully appreciate some in the chamber and some in the community do not support the intent of these Christians, but no one could doubt their sincerity, and I certainly can't. I know a number of them, Margaret Pestorius, Andrew Paine in particular, I know very well, a very committed and very effective young peaceful activist, Jim Dowling, who has been a peace activist in Brisbane for many years, as well as Tim Webb, Franz Dowling, and also Paul Christie, who was arrested separately. So I can vouch and do vouch and will vouch personally for the peaceful intent and the genuine commitment to peace of these people. And I join with over 70 Australians who put their name to an open letter to Senator Brandis that was published last Saturday in the Saturday paper, calling for clemency, because right at this minute the Commonwealth is doing the exact opposite. They are seeking to get jail time, significant jail time, for these peaceful protesters. And even since the time of these protesters, even more information, since the time these protests happened, even more information has come out about the key role that Pine Gap plays in drone warfare and enabling and increasing and expanding war, and clearly exacerbating the fulcrum and the conditions that enable terrorism to develop further. So I join with those Australians in calling on the Attorney-General to reconsider his action, to call for clemency and to seek to ensure clemency for these Pine Gap peaceful Christian protesters. Respect those calls for freedom of peaceful expression, freedom of peaceful political communication, freedom of peaceful personal expression of religious beliefs. And I would like to seek leave of the chamber for the open letter to Senator Brandis to be incorporated in the Hansard.
Is leave granted?
Yes.
Leave granted, Senator Bartlett.
I thank the chamber for that, and I do ask that all senators consider lending their support to this call privately, if you wish, to approach the Attorney-General and seek to get a different approach. So many of the people that have been part of these protests, every part of these protests, each one of them have had a significant component of them who have been peaceful protesters who have sought to simply express the message of the Prince of Peace, as Christians call Jesus, and ask those Christian values that we hear talked about so often, including from many in Senator Brandis's party, to have them actually lived out in practice, not just in word. So on behalf of the Greens, all of my other Greens colleagues put their name to this letter, and I certainly express my same support for them, for these fellow Queenslanders, And I'm not a religious person, but I'd make the exception of adding some prayers as well for their well-being and their outcome, and for a change in policy in regards to this dreadful part of the global war machine that is the Pine Gap spy base.
Thank you, Senator Bartlett.